What if the worst relationship of your life wasn't a punishment, but a preparation? What if the person who tried to break you was actually the place where you learned how unbreakable you are? I want to say something that may feel uncomfortable at first, but stay with me. You were not placed in that relationship because you were weak. You were placed there because you had something powerful inside you that needed to be revealed. Narcissistic relationships don't attach themselves to empty people. They attach to people with empathy, depth, loyalty, and a capacity to love deeply. That wasn't your flaw. That was your gift. You walked into that connection believing in goodness, in repair, in honesty. You believed that love could soften sharp edges, that patience could heal wounds, that showing up consistently would eventually be met with the same care. And for a while, it felt magical because mirroring can feel like destiny. But slowly, the ground shifted. Your needs became too much. Your questions became attacks. Your pain became invisible. Here's the hard truth. That relationship wasn't about mutual love. It was about extraction. Your energy, your forgiveness, your emotional labor were being consumed. And yet, even in that imbalance, something sacred was happening. You were being confronted with the difference between attachment and connection, between chemistry and character, between someone who wants you and someone who wants access to you. God didn't put you there to lose yourself. You were placed there to learn discernment, to discover boundaries, to understand that love without accountability is not love, it's control. And the moment you began to wake up, the moment you felt that quiet inner resistance, that was the beginning of your winning. There's a moment in every narcissistic relationship that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but inside you. It's seismic. It's the moment you start doubting your own reality, not because you're confused, but because you're being trained to distrust yourself. And I need you to hear this clearly. That wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. You began by asking reasonable questions. You asked for clarity, for consistency, for emotional safety, and somehow those basic human needs were twisted into accusations. You were told you were too sensitive, too emotional, reading into things. Over time, you didn't just question the relationship, you questioned your instincts. And that is where the deepest damage happens. But here's the part we don't talk about enough. The very thing they tried to destroy in you became the place of your awakening. Every time your body tightened, every time your chest felt heavy, every time something felt off but you couldn't explain why, that was wisdom. That was discernment speaking before your language caught up. God allows exposure so truth can surface. You weren't meant to stay confused forever. You were meant to feel the dissonance so strongly that you could no longer ignore it. This wasn't cruelty. It was contrast. You were learning what manipulation feels like so you could forever recognize peace. And here's where you start winning. Even before you leave, the moment you stop arguing for your reality, the moment you stop over explaining your pain, the moment you realize that clarity doesn't require permission, that silence, distance, and boundaries are not punishments. They are protection. They needed you uncertain. You needed you awake. And once you saw it, even briefly, the dynamic had already begun to collapse. One of the hardest truths to face is this: you didn't just love them, you abandoned parts of yourself trying to keep the peace. And that wasn't because you lacked strength. It was because you were taught that harmony mattered more than honesty. So you learned to soften your voice, minimize your needs, and explain away behaviors that made your soul feel tired. You became skilled at emotional gymnastics. You anticipated moods. You read between silences. You learned how to stay calm while chaos sat right next to you. And while the world might call that being understanding, your nervous system was quietly paying the price. You were surviving, not living. Here's what matters. God does not require self-erasure for love. Love that demands you disappear is not love. It's fear dressed up as intimacy. And slowly, painfully, you began to feel that truth in your body. Exhaustion set in. Anxiety lingered. Joy felt distant. That wasn't weakness. That was your inner self signaling that something sacred was being violated. This relationship forced you to confront a question many people avoid their entire lives. What does it cost me to stay? And once that question is asked honestly, everything changes. Because staying began to feel heavier than leaving. Explaining began to feel harder than silence. And pretending began to feel more painful than the truth. You didn't fail at love. You graduated from a version of love that required suffering. And the moment you started choosing your well-being over their approval, the power shifted. Quietly, internally, irreversibly. That's not the end of the story, but it's the turning point. There comes a moment when you stop asking why they do this and start asking why you tolerated it. And that question isn't about blame, it's about ownership. Because healing doesn't begin when we diagnose them. Healing begins when we reclaim ourselves. You were conditioned long before this relationship to equate love with endurance, to believe that staying, fixing, forgiving endlessly was noble. Somewhere along the way, you learned that being good meant being accommodating, self-sacrificing, agreeable. So when someone tested those limits, you didn't leave, you leaned in harder. That wasn't foolishness, that was conditioning. God doesn't expose our patterns to shame us. He exposes them to free us. This relationship didn't create your wounds. It illuminated them. It showed you where you overgave, where you overfunctioned, where you confused responsibility with rescue. And once seen, those patterns can never fully go back to sleep. Here's the quiet victory you began to notice. You noticed how often you apologized first, how rarely your pain was repaired, how accountability was expected from you but avoided by them. Awareness is not passive. It's powerful, because once you see the imbalance, you can't unsee it. And this is where the shift happens. You stop chasing closure from someone incapable of self-reflection. You stop explaining your humanity to someone invested in your silence. You realize that clarity doesn't come from their understanding. It comes from your acceptance of what is. You weren't put there to fix them. You were put there to break a cycle. And the moment you stopped abandoning yourself, the cycle lost its grip. Let's talk about the moment they felt you slipping away, not physically, but energetically. You were still there, still present, still trying, but something in you had changed. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped chasing reassurance. You stopped begging to be seen. And that shift threatened the entire dynamic. Narcissistic control doesn't survive self-respect. It feeds on reaction, on self-doubt, on your willingness to keep proving your worth. So when you began choosing silence over arguments, boundaries over justification, the power imbalance cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. This is where many people feel guilt. You questioned yourself. Am I becoming cold? Am I giving up too easily? But what you were actually doing was conserving your energy. You were learning that access to you is a privilege, not an entitlement. And that realization is radical for someone who was taught to earn love through effort. God doesn't shout transformation. He allows it to unfold. Your strength didn't come from confrontation. It came from restraint, from no longer volunteering your vulnerability to someone who weaponized it, from choosing dignity over being right, peace over proving. And here's the win you may not recognize yet. You stopped playing a game that was rigged. You no longer needed them to validate your experience. You trusted yourself. And the moment you stopped seeking approval from someone who benefits from your insecurity, you become unreachable to manipulation. You didn't harden your heart. You strengthened your spine. And that is not loss. That is growth. There's a painful irony in this kind of relationship. The more you healed, the more unsafe you became to them. Not because you were attacking, but because you were no longer available for control. Your calm became a boundary. Your clarity became a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous to people who avoid accountability. You started seeing patterns instead of promises, behavior instead of words, consistency instead of apologies. And once that shift happens, the fantasy collapses. You weren't becoming cruel. You were becoming discerning. You weren't withdrawing love. You were withdrawing access. This is where God's purpose becomes clearer. You were never meant to stay small to keep someone else comfortable. You were meant to learn the difference between compassion and self-betrayal, between grace and tolerance, between forgiveness and continued exposure to harm. And here's the truth many people miss, and winning doesn't always look like leaving immediately. Sometimes winning looks like detaching internally long before you walk away physically. It looks like no longer absorbing blame that doesn't belong to you, like refusing to participate in circular conversations designed to exhaust you, like choosing your nervous system over their narrative. They may have called you distant, changed, unloving, but what you actually became was regulated, grounded, aware, and that version of you could no longer be controlled by guilt, fear, or hope alone. You didn't lose yourself in that relationship. You found the part of you that refuses to disappear again. And once found, that part doesn't negotiate with chaos. Here's the truth nobody tells you: the narcissist's presence in your life was never about them. It was about you discovering the depth of your own strength. Every gaslight, every manipulation, every emotional roller coaster was a test of your resilience. And guess what? You passed not because it was easy, but because you refused to forget who you are. You learned to identify emotional theft. You learned to notice when words don't match actions. You learned that your energy is sacred and must be protected at all costs. And with every step of awareness, something shifted inside. You started choosing yourself even when fear whispered that love would be lost. You realized that love that hurts consistently is not love. It's attachment to illusion. God placed you there not to punish you, but to reveal your courage. You were being asked to confront your boundaries, to meet your shadow, and to reclaim the power that had always belonged to you. And here's the kicker: once you understood that your value doesn't depend on their recognition, nothing could diminish you. Every moment of confusion became a lesson in discernment. Every betrayal became a proof of your inner compass. Every heartbreak became a catalyst for your awakening. You didn't just survive, you learned how to thrive within yourself, independent of external validation. The victory wasn't in changing them, it was in finally choosing yourself. And that is the kind of triumph that can never be taken away. Now, let's talk about what it truly means to win. It doesn't mean revenge. It doesn't mean shaming them or proving them wrong. Winning means walking away from the chaos with your integrity intact. It means reclaiming the parts of yourself that were dimmed, silenced, or questioned. It means choosing life over manipulation, peace over drama, and your truth over their narrative. You begin to see the extraordinary courage in your own story. You faced someone who thrived on power, deceit, and illusion, and you didn't just endure. You observed. You learned. You grew. You refused to give them the keys to your soul any longer. That is victory. That is triumph. That is your divinely guided awakening. And here's the beautiful paradox. By being placed in their orbit, you discovered the boundaries you never knew you could hold. You discovered patience, yes, but also strength, clarity, and a devotion to self that cannot be negotiated away. You learned that love without reciprocity is a lesson, not a life sentence. You realized that you are never diminished by someone else's incapacity to honor you. The moment you accept this, your energy shifts. You stop fighting for recognition that was never intended. You stop shrinking for someone else's comfort. You stop questioning your instincts, your worth, your lovability. And in that surrender to yourself, you emerge untouchable. Victory doesn't feel like celebration at first. It feels like relief. It feels like breathing again after years of holding your own air hostage. And from that breath, all else flows clarity, peace, and unshakable self-respect. By now, you realize something profound. The narcissist's role in your life was never to stay. It was to teach, illuminate, and eventually release. Every lie, every gaslight, every cycle of chaos was a spotlight on your resilience. You didn't just survive their toxicity. You discovered the depth of your courage, the sharpness of your intuition, and the unshakable value of your boundaries. Think about it. You were confronted with someone who thrived on control, yet here you are reclaiming control over your own life. You were faced with constant invalidation, yet you are now anchored in self-validation. You were shown deception at its finest, yet you have learned to recognize truth wherever it exists. That's not accidental, that's design, divine design. And the ultimate truth is this: your liberation was never dependent on their change, it was dependent on your awakening. The moment you stopped arguing for their accountability, the moment you stopped begging for recognition, the moment you finally stopped explaining your worth, you stepped into freedom. The chains weren't on your wrists, they were in your mind. And once released, there is no force on earth that can imprison your soul again. God doesn't put obstacles in your path to punish you. He puts people there to refine you, to show you your strength, to teach you to love yourself fiercely. And when you finally understand that you recognize the ultimate victory, you weren't just a survivor, you were always meant to be a warrior of your own life. So here is the final truth. You didn't just endure a narcissist, you were refined by them. You didn't just survive the storm, you learned to dance in the rain while keeping your heart whole. You didn't lose your love, you learned how to give it without losing yourself. And that is the victory you carry forever. The person who tried to diminish you, control you, and erase your value actually revealed something far greater: your strength, your wisdom, and your unshakable self-worth. Every tear, every sleepless night, every heartbreak was a lesson in courage disguised as pain. And now pain has become your teacher, and resilience has become your armor. Remember this always: the lesson was never about them, it was about you. About discovering that you are enough, that your boundaries matter, that your heart is sacred, that the approval of someone unwilling to honor your humanity is irrelevant, and that your life is yours to live fully, freely, and fiercely. You have won, not because they lost, but because you chose yourself, because you refused to shrink, because you reclaimed your voice, your peace, and your power. And in doing so, you've become untouchable, unshakable, and unstoppable. Walk forward knowing this: the divine placement of people in your life, no matter how painful, was never to break you. It was to awaken you. And now you are awake